Welcome back to Comic Krackle, I'm your host, Kirby. Now today's video is going to be a lot different than the normal standard fare. You see, I began doing this video because I wanted to celebrate Black History Month on the channel, so I started looking into the early issues of Luke Cage. While I was reading these issues, a name really stood out to me. Billy Graham. And before you ask, no, it's not that Billy Graham. On the first issue of Luke Cage Hero for Hire, Billy Graham is credited as the inker for both John Romita Sr. and George Tuska. However, as the series progressed, he worked his way up to not only being the penciler for the series, but also the co-scripter. I saw his cover for issue 4 of Luke Cage and I thought about it for an entire day. There's this momentum of action that's portrayed, as well as the depth perception of something coming at Luke Cage alongside the reader. It really stood out to me and I thought it could be reminiscent of artists today like Daniel Warren Johnson, but I didn't know who this artist was. You have to keep in mind in the 1970s, while Luke Cage was coming out, that Marvel was still dealing with the aftermath of Jack Kirby leaving the company. So the vast majority of artists were really taking up the house style of John Romita Sr. Billy Graham stood out because he didn't fall into the category of just doing John Romita Sr., but wholly original. Obviously, with a name like Billy Graham, especially during the 1970s, I needed to find out who this artist was. So instead of truncating his biography into the preamble for a Luke Cage video, I figured I would just make an individual video talking about this wonderful artist that changed the comics medium forever. But before we get into that, let's hear a word from our sponsor. William Billy Graham was born July 1st, 1935. He was first introduced to comics by his cousin at a young age. His cousin would read through the issues and then give them over to Billy. Billy would then trace over the individual panels, breaking down how these artists brought these characters to life off of the page. When he was in elementary school, he participated in a drawing contest that was for an initiative to keep your city clean, and he actually won the grand prize of $25. But you should keep in mind, adjusted for inflation, that's about $350 today, so it's not too shabby for a beginning artist. Graham would attend New York City's High School of Music and Art, as well as the School of Visual Art. He was able to do so because he enrolled in the Navy and served for 4 years, and then was able to be granted a GI Bill which paid for his schooling. While he was in school, he studied under the Tarzan artist Ern Hogarth. He wouldn't initially enter the comics industry after graduating, but instead going into commercial art. Billy would move on to go and work at EC Comics, just not in the position that he wanted. He started off working in the mailroom of EC Comics, but he used this opportunity to connect with industry veterans who would provide notes on his art while they were in the office. They weren't just industry veterans, but they were also artists that Billy personally looked up to, those of which include Al Williamson, Johnny Craig, Marie Severin, and Bill Gaines. These artists would look over the sample pages that Billy would bring in and provide additional insight into how he could hone his craft. One of his earliest published works was working for Warren Publishing's first issue of Vampirella. He wrote and illustrated a story titled Death Boat, which was a vampire spin on the film Lifeboat. He would then go on to pencil Vampirella issue 2 to 12. Within these pages, he would homage some of the illustrators that inspired him the most, including Al Williamson, Frank Frazetta, and Wally Wood. From there, Graham would be quickly promoted to art director of Warren Publishing. This would not only be the first time that Warren Publishing had a person of color in this position, but throughout the entirety of the comics industry. In an interview, the publisher, James Warren, would recount giving this promotion to Billy Graham by stating, "I sensed Billy had the ability to handle it. Certain artists and writers are great, but they can't shift out of their specialty and do something else. Billy could. So I said, Billy, you are now art director, whether you like it or not. Now you have to understand that all Billy wanted to do his whole life was be Jack Kirby. I said, you'll be Black Jack Kirby, but not today. Today, you are art director of Warren Publishing. But he said, I can't art direct. And I said, I'll show you how. There's your office. You now have a full-time job, a paycheck every Friday. Do you accept? And he said, you're goddamn right. And I taught him how to art direct during our slow period, and it only took a couple of issues. And he did pretty well, though I gave him a nervous breakdown. These nervous breakdowns would inspire some of the most eye-catching and memorable pages from Warren Publishing. Not only would Billy maintain artistic oversight, but he was also credited as managing editor from July 1971 to April 1972. This is the section that's typically covered the most, from the New York Times to Wikipedia. But something that really stood out to me is that Billy never shied away from his influences, and he basically wore them on his sleeve. At the same time, he didn't let those influences overtake his artistic decisions. I mean, he made it from the mailroom of EC Comics all the way up to Warren Publishing's art director, in the 1970s no less. Although, like many other artists in the medium, Billy wouldn't stay in one place for long, which brings me to his time over at Marvel Comics. In 1972, Graham moved over to Marvel, working as the anchor for George Tuska, a personal idol of Billy. He would start work on the debut issue of Luke Cage Hero for Hire. I'll be touching on this a little bit further in the next video talking about Luke Cage, but this debut issue was a cultural milestone for the comics industry. While there were other black characters that predated him, Luke Cage was the first time that an African-American superhero had his own individual title. Billy joining this creative team would make him the first black comics creator within superhero comics. And it's not only that. As the series went on, he was able to provide creative input to fully form these characters. While I was doing research, I came upon a quote from Roy Thomas that perfectly distills my contempt that I have for that man. When he was asked about adding Billy Graham to the creative team, he stated, "I had something to do, maybe a lot to do, with his being assigned to ink Luke Cage from the beginning in order to get the look of the characters right." Now, around this time is when Roy Thomas was promoted to editor-in-chief by Stan Lee, and to this day he's still taking credit for the creator's works done under his tenure. I mean, we see this as recently as March of 2024, where he was claiming to have a pivotal role in the creation of Wolverine. For reference, editors do not and should not claim creative credit for the work done under their oversight. The reason being is because editors are not work for hire, and they have little input into the creative decisions done by the writers and artists and inkers. But because Roy Thomas graduated from the school of Stan Lee's credit to creators, this is where we are. In short, Roy Thomas is scum. Anyways, back to Graham. Like I stated previously, Graham started the series by inking George Tuska, but by issue 4 he was sharing artistic duties. And the cover for issue 4 is where I pinpointed the change for artistic depiction of the series. Starting with the story titled Cry Fear, Cry Phantom, Graham was able to showcase his artistic influences of EC Comics with a wider audience from Marvel. It was on issue 6 that Steve Englehart started taking up the writing duties alongside George Tuska and Billy Graham. By issue 13, Graham had taken over sole artistic duties of the series. It was at this point that Graham was credited as not only the penciler, but also the co-plotter. Steve Englehart reflects on his tenure on the series, as well as the working relationship with Billy Graham, by stating, "During the first year, he, George Tuska, and I worked on Luke Cage. I probably interacted with Billy twice at most. Writers talk to pencilers and inkers aren't in the loop. So it wasn't until Billy became the penciler that we started really talking. Everybody involved with that book to that point except Billy was white, and I wanted to hear what I didn't know, and he was happy, literally happy, to tell me. He had a lot to say, and as an inker, he had little hope of getting it said. We had lunches together when we were both in the city, and they went on for hours. He contributed so much to Luke Cage that I immediately credited him as co-plotter. But only a few months later, Matt Master of Kung Fu got greenlit and I had to drop Cage, and right after that I moved to California. So it's those few months when he and I were a real team that I really knew Billy, professionally and personally. At those lunches, he was a fun guy to hang out with, but he was very focused on the work. Then again, he was teaching me stuff. After Englehart left the book, Tony Isabella took over the scripting duties for the series, but because of strenuous deadlines, Billy moved on to Black Panther's first solo series. Billy would join the creative team for Jungle Action at issue 10, where he would partner with longtime friend and collaborator Don McGregor. Don and Billy had known each other since Billy was early in his comics career working at Warren Publishing. McGregor went to the publisher James Warren and said that the stories that were being published didn't live up to the art produced by Billy. It was there that they would start their friendship, but they wouldn't work together until Jungle Action took place. This partnership would be met with critical acclaim because each one of them would elevate the other's work. The duo would not only tell some of the most memorable stories for Black Panther, but also expanding his mythos. They would not be averse to telling controversial stories within the series, because within the title, they would have Black Panther fight the Klan, which happened in issue 21 to 26. For both Luke Cage and Black Panther, Billy Graham was able to provide needed input to form these characters into what we know them to be today. They were able to expand beyond their white creators and the blaxploitation era of the time. Alex Simmons, creator of Blackjack, as well as friends with Billy Graham, would talk about him leaving Black Panther as well as Marvel by stating, "It wasn't like Marvel was his whole life. He didn't let go of who he was or where he was from in order to be accepted in another world. He was already on to something else." Graham would leave Marvel and work on Sabre alongside Don McGregor for Eclipse Comics from issue 3 to issue 9. Sabre showcased a new kind of black protagonist that transcended the blaxploitation genre. The series made the title character a swashbuckling adventurer within a post-apocalyptic fantasy setting. The two creators would work on the series telling high-concept stories as well as pushing the boundaries for what could be done within comics. Don McGregor would talk about his time working alongside Graham within the series by stating, "I was good friends with Billy Graham, and I knew Billy was not going to have any problems with gay characters and the childbirth happening or having Deary Decadence be transsexual. He'd have no problem with any of it. Just give me the script, Don, and I'll draw what you've written," he would say. Billy introduced me to much of the comics world. He took me to Louise and Jeffrey Jones comic gatherings. He embraced my scripts and drew a number of pages, many of which never see print because he didn't have time to finish them. Taking a brief glance at just some of the pages within Sabre, I can definitely see the influences of Jack Kirby's imagination, but also the influences of Al Williamson and Frank Frazetta to showcase this fantasy setting, but also showcasing it in a way that's grounding the characters. I would love to dedicate an entire video on Sabre, so if you're interested in that, just leave a comment down below. Billy Graham was not only defined by his accomplishments within the comics industry, because he was so much more than that. After leaving the comics industry, he would go on to write historical plays, one of which was about the famous tap dancer named Bill Bojangles Robinson. Another would be about his uncle, who happened to be a one-pocket billiards player named Detroit Slim. He even wrote a play about the historical Move standoff with police officers that happened in Philadelphia. If you aren't familiar with this, Move was a black liberation group that was located within Philadelphia. The police had attempted to evict the members of Move from their home that they were currently located. When the members had refused to evacuate, the police dropped 2 explosive devices on the home from helicopter, as well as shooting at the house. They allowed for the fire from these explosives to burn for 90 minutes. The fire took out 61 homes, leaving leaving 250 people homeless. On top of that, this also killed 11 people, 5 of which were children. The Move bombing also served as inspiration for the Big Bang that happened within Milestone Comics. Graham's accomplishments wouldn't stop there. He also worked on set design, where he would also get awards for his work. He would also perform at the Apollo Theater in Harlem, where he would do stand-up comedy. Also at the Apollo, he would MC for bands like The Spinners and the OJs. He would also go on to write treatments for films, as well as writing individual TV episodes. And again, it doesn't stop there. Billy Graham was also within the films Scenes from a Mall, New Jack City, The Preacher's Wife, and Mo Better Blues. He never knew how to remain stagnant, and he was always pushing to be the best of the next interest that he had. His last published work within comics was alongside writer Christopher Priest, then under the pseudonym Jim Owsley, for Power Man and Iron Fist number 114. William Graham passed away April 4th, 1997 at the age of 61. In July 2024, Graham's family attended San Diego Comic-Con, where Graham and longtime collaborator Don McGregor were both inducted into the Eisner's Hall of Fame. Billy Graham is a comics creator that should not only be remembered for his influence over characters, but also being a pioneer alongside Matt Baker for people of color within the comics industry. Billy Graham being within the comics industry not only fully formed these characters, but also allowed for the likes of Christopher Priest, Dwayne McDuffie, and everyone that we see in the modern day. We're all aware of the black superheroes that we love, but the creators often get overlooked. I wanted to utilize this video as a means to expand on my thoughts about Billy Graham, while also giving me an opportunity to research a creator I wasn't familiar with. I like to think of myself as somebody that knows about the comics industry, but I hate that I just happened to see a funny name in the issues of early Luke Cage comics, and this is what made me find out about this creator. I think that everybody should know the name Billy Graham in the same way that we talk about Jack Kirby, Stan Lee, and Steve Ditko. If you're interested in Billy Graham and want to jump from here and read more into his life, I'm going to list a bunch of the resources that I found very valuable in doing this video. Alongside that, I'm also going to link to the socials that are run by Graham's family that continues his legacy today. Alright, that's going to be enough out of me. If you like this video, you're more than likely going to like the Luke Cage video that's coming at the end of the month, so you might as well subscribe. Also, on the right, I'm going to put a recommended video as well as a recommended playlist if you want to watch more of me. Thank you so much for watching, and don't forget, go read some comics, or else.